This is Politics UK. I'm Helen Catt. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Belfast, Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Sean Curran. On the programme, a historic week in Northern Ireland as Michelle O'Neill becomes the first nationalist First Minister.
I am honoured to stand here as First Minister. We mark a moment of equality and a moment of progress.
I recognise that for many today, it is an historic moment with the nomination of Michelle O'Neill and myself as First Ministers.
Now that the power-sharing government is back after 2 years, we'll look at the challenges ahead. The murder of the transgender teenager Brianna Jai leads to this exchange at PMQs.
Defining a woman! Although in fairness, that was only 99% of a U-turn.
Of all the weeks to say that, when Brianna's mother is in this chamber. Shame.
The UK joins the US in more airstrikes against Houthi targets in Yemen.
We're not seeking confrontation, but if necessary, the UK will not hesitate to respond again in self-defence.
And can the Health Secretary fix the problems with NHS dentistry in England?
A long-term plan to make dental care faster, simpler and fairer for people across the country.
1 in 10 people have been forced to attempt DIY dentistry, Dickensian conditions.
Well, let's start by going to Stormont and speaking to our reporter, Jim Fitzpatrick. Now, Jim, as we saw in the headlines, it's been quite a week with the return of the Northern Ireland Assembly and, for the first time, a nationalist First Minister.
Yes, Helen, that's Michelle O'Neill of Sinn Féin, the Republican Party. And the system of government here means that the position of First Minister goes to the party with the biggest representation here at Stormont. And after the last Assembly election, that party is Sinn Féin. And Sinn Féin, of course, wants a united Ireland. Then the Deputy First Minister position goes to the other biggest party of the other denomination, the Unionist Party, and that's, in this case, the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP. And the Deputy First Minister position is now held by Emma Little-Pengelly of the DUP. So a big first there in the fact that we have now both a first nationalist First Minister and indeed the first double female team at the top. And the titles, they sound different. You might think there's a difference in them, but legally they're exactly the same. First and Deputy First Minister have exactly the same powers. Another first is that they are supported by junior ministers. Again, in this case, we have 2 new junior ministers who are both female. So a lot of change there in the top department. And what's brought us back to this position? Well, we've had 2 years where the DUP walked out of government in protest at post-Brexit trading arrangements, which they said put a barrier between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. The UK government worked hard with the EU to come up with new measures that might make that situation better for the DUP, and that was the Windsor Framework. The DUP said that was progress, but not enough, so they continued to negotiate with the government, and then the government brought forward legislation, which we saw changes that the DUP felt meant that they could now re-enter government, and that meant that on Saturday, 2 years to the day that the DUP left government, the institutions here at Stormont were restored. So let's hear what that new First Minister and Deputy First Minister had to say.
Today opens the door to a future, a shared future. I am honoured to stand here as First Minister. We mark a moment of equality and a moment of progress, a new opportunity to work and to grow together. Confident in that wherever we come from, whatever our aspirations are, we can and we must build our future together. I'm really delighted to see every MLA back in this chamber today, and I welcome the fact that the DUP have decided to re-enter the democratic institutions and that the outcome of last year's Assembly election is now being respected.
Michelle O'Neill and I come from very different backgrounds. But regardless of that, for my part, I will work tirelessly to ensure that we can deliver for all in Northern Ireland. I recognise that for many today, it is an historic moment with the nomination of Michelle O'Neill and myself as First Ministers. It is a day that confirms the democratic outcome of the election. Mr. Speaker, serving people in this House in any role is an honour and a privilege. It is an opportunity to shape Northern Ireland for the better and to make a meaningful difference.
So we see perhaps a change of tone there, an attempt to reset relationships here at Stormont, very positive from both Michelle O'Neill and Emma Little-Pengelly. It reminds me of the first time we saw the DUP and Sinn Féin enter government together, albeit with those two roles reversed, when it was Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness. They became ultimately known as the Chuckle Brothers because they got on so well. That didn't go down so well with some in the grassroots of those parties. But here we have the two parties again, back in government, trying to reset the tone and show that they mean business and they mean to get down to business.
We also had a big decision from one of the parties this week, the SDLP. They've decided to go into opposition. So what's the thinking there?
Well, perhaps, Helen, it's because they didn't really have too many other choices. Positions within government here in our power-sharing government are allocated on the basis of party strength. And they use a formula called the D'Hondt formula, which is named after the Belgian mathematician Victor D'Hondt. It's somewhat complicated, but it's a bit like the old days in school when you used to pick the football team and you started with the person that you wanted most and then the person that you wanted last at the end, and that's how the ministries are allocated. But the SDLP didn't get enough strength in the election to be guaranteed a position in government. So they've decided to go into official opposition. Matthew O'Toole is the new leader of that official opposition, and here he is outlining what he plans to do.
This place has changed. We are a plural society, but we have struggled to combine inclusive governance with effective governance. This is the last chance we have to get it right for the people we serve. The SDLP's job as a constructive opposition is not, as some have said, to tear lumps out of anyone. It is to bring long-awaited accountability, to lift up our democracy, to lift up our people, to deliver hope, change and ambition in equal measure. Our collective job is to finally prove that this place can work. So once we've finished with the ceremony today, let's get down to that work.
So we see Matthew O'Toole there using the terms constructive opposition. The SDLP was, to some extent, one of the kind of architects of this whole structure of government here. So they have to be constructive about it. But we will see how long that atmosphere of constructive opposition lasts whenever they get into the nitty-gritty of some of the policies.
Indeed. So now that the Assembly and the government are back up and running, what are the priorities going to be?
Well, very simply, it's public services. Most of the public services here are under some stress. And that's because of not just funds, but also because of a lack of strategic direction over the last 2 years. We've been in a sort of halfway house where there hasn't been devolution, but there hasn't either been direct rule. So civil servants have been keeping mind of the shop, if you like, in the meantime, but they haven't been able to take key decisions. So those decisions have built up in the meantime, and it's up to the parties now to implement those decisions, and they also need the funds to do it. The government has put money on the table, $3.3 billion, to help smooth the restoration of devolution. But funny enough, the parties are saying that it's not enough. Sounds like a big number, but here's Michelle O'Neill outlining why they're only asking for what they really need.
We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for fairness and equality. We're not asking for funding, or we are asking for funding that reflects the needs of the people that we serve. And we are asking for a funding model that is taken for granted in Scotland and Wales, but it's currently being denied to us here. We will make our case to the Westminster Government with determination and commitment. And just yesterday we had the opportunity to meet with the Prime Minister, and we put that to him directly, and we presented him with a letter setting out all of the facts and the evidence.
Like the First Minister, I welcome the support on this very important issue. We felt it was incredibly important for us to be here and for both of us to contribute to this debate, to show that there is a very strong and joint endeavour here in terms of trying to get the right and fair settlement for Northern Ireland, while recognising progress has been made. And I welcome the fact that right across this chamber and across many of, if not with some exceptions, all of the political parties represented, there has been a strong support for what we are trying to achieve.
Once again there we see a united front between Sinn Féin and the DUP. And I suppose the point about the money is that although there's a lot of money on the table now, and that will help pay for some of the things that need to be paid for, but some of those things are pay increases for public servants across the board, and the money's only there for this year. It doesn't cover future years. So we can see why they'll be building up an argument that they need something more to ensure there's some stability here in the years to come.
Thanks, Jim. Well, let's now turn to Westminster, to our parliamentary correspondent, Sean Curran. So as we saw earlier, there was a pretty tense exchange between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer this week at Prime Minister's Questions around the brutal and tragic murder of the teenager Brianna Ghey. What happened?
Well, this was always going to be an interesting Prime Minister's Questions because there was a lot for the parties to talk about. So Labour had gone in. They wanted to talk about that interview that Rishi Sunak gave to Piers Morgan earlier in the week when he talked about missing NHS targets, and he also made the £1,000 bet on his Rwanda policy. Both leaders also wanted to talk about the King and his cancer diagnosis. But as you say, last week, 2 teenagers were sentenced to life for the murder of 16-year-old Brianna Ghey. And in the sentencing, the judge said it was a brutal and sadistic murder. And she said that a secondary motive in the killing had been Brianna's trans identity. Now, Brianna's mother, Esther, was in Westminster this week. She'd been invited by her local MP to come, and she was going to be sitting in on a debate about mindfulness because she supports a campaign for mindfulness to be taught in all schools in England. So that's why she was at Westminster. The Labour leader, Keir Starmer, mentioned her presence, and then in the exchanges that followed, as we saw in the headlines, there were some rather tense and angry moments.
Mr. Speaker, I know the thoughts of the House and the country are with the King and his family. We wish His Majesty a speedy recovery and look forward to him resuming his public-facing duties in due course.
I join with the Prime Minister in sending His Majesty the King our very best wishes for his treatment. Across this House, we all look forward to seeing him back to full health as quickly as possible. Mr. Speaker, this week the unwavering bravery of Brianna Ghey's mother, Esther, has touched us all. As a father, I can't even imagine the pain that she's going through, and I'm glad that she's with us in the gallery here today. Mr. Speaker, a year ago, the Prime Minister promised to bring NHS waiting lists down. Isn't he glad he didn't bet a grand on it?
At least I stand by my commitments. He's so indecisive, the only bet he'd make is an each-way bet.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he says he stands by his commitments. He once insisted that if he missed his promises, these are the words he used, I'm the Prime Minister, and then he said, it's on me personally. Today we learned from his own officials that he's the blocker to any deal to end the doctor strikes. Yep. And he's always, every time he's asked, he blames everyone else. So what exactly did he mean when he said it's on him personally if he doesn't meet his promise?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we are bringing the waiting list down for the longest waiters. We're making progress. But it's a bit rich, Mr. Speaker, to hear about promises from someone who's broken every single promise he was elected on. I mean, I think I counted almost 30 in the last year. Pensions, planning, peerages, public sector pay, tuition fees, childcare, second referendums, defining a woman. Although in fairness, that was only 99% of a U-turn. The list goes on, but the theme is the same, Mr. Speaker. It's empty words, broken promises, and absolutely no plan.
Of all the weeks to say that, when Brianna's mother is in this chamber, shame, parading as a man of integrity when he's got absolutely no responsibility. I think the role of the Prime Minister is ensure that every single citizen in this country feels safe and respected. It's a shame the Prime Minister doesn't share that. I welcome the fact that he's finally admitted that he's failed on waiting lists in the NHS. I also welcome that he's finally acknowledged the crisis in NHS dentistry. He's calling it a recovery plan after 14 years of Tory government. What exactly does he think the NHS dentistry is recovering from?
We're putting more funding in to provide more NHS provision across the country, on top of plans that will see the number of dental training places increase by 40%, Mr. Speaker. But I would actually just point out, our plans mean that there will be 2.5 million more NHS appointments, which is in fact 3 times more than the Labour Party are proposing.
The truth is, after 14 years of neglect, this recovery plan is just a desperate attempt to try to recover back to square one. If he wanted to move forward, he should follow Labour, scrap the non-dom tax status, use the money to fund 2 million more hospital appointments every year. But, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is oddly reluctant to follow us on this. What exactly is so special about this tax avoidance scheme that the Prime Minister prioritises it above the NHS?
Well, Mr. Speaker, let's look at that record. We've, in the NHS, record funding, record doctors and nurses, record number of appointments, higher cancer survival rates. But what's happening under Labour's watch in Wales, Mr. Speaker? Let's have a look. A fifth of people in Wales are currently on a waiting list. Waits of 18 months or more are 10 times higher than that in England, and people are waiting twice as long for an operation. Their failure has sent the Welsh NHS back to square one, and we'll never let them do that here. Also, to Brianna Gray's mum, who is here, as I've said earlier this week, what happened was an unspeakable and shocking tragedy, Mr. Speaker. And as I said earlier this week, in the face of that, for her mother to demonstrate the compassion and empathy that she did last weekend, I thought demonstrated the very best of humanity in the face of seeing the very worst of humanity, and she deserves all our admiration and praise for that.
Well, among that, we heard Keir Starmer talking about the government's plans for NHS dentistry in England. We did hear from the Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins, later, didn't we?
Yes, she was sitting right next to Rishi Sunak during those exchanges. Yeah, earlier in the week, we saw those extraordinary pictures from Bristol where people were literally queuing round the block because a new NHS dentist had opened and people were very keen to register. So it's been an issue that's been debated and argued about at Westminster for some time. But this week, the government published plans which are designed to incentivise dentists and encourage them to open up in areas where there is a shortage of NHS practices. And the Health Secretary came to the Commons and made a statement about those plans.
Thanks to a once-in-a-generation pandemic between 2020 and 2022, 7 million patients across England did not come forward for appointments with NHS dentists. Since then, we have taken decisive action to recover services. But we know that too many, particularly those living in rural or coastal communities, are still struggling to find appointments. This recovery plan will put this right by making NHS dental care faster, simpler and fairer for patients and staff.
After 14 years of Conservative government, NHS dentistry is in decay. 8 in 10 dentists are not taking on new patients. In the southwest of England, the figure is 99%. 1 in 10 people have been forced to attempt DIY dentistry, Dickensian conditions, because they can't see an NHS dentist and they can't afford to go private. By adopting much of Labour's rescue plan for dentistry, doesn't it just show that the Conservatives are out of ideas of their own and they are looking to Labour to fix the mess they have made?
Their ambitions reach only as far as 700,000 more appointments. Our plan will provide more than 3 times the number of appointments across the country, 2.5 million to help him with his maths. And then the centrepiece of their proposals, making teachers swap their textbooks for toothbrushes, an idea that is hated by teachers and patronises parents. We believe that most parents do a great job of looking after their children.
Thank you, Sean. We'll come back to you later. But let's go to Holyrood now and speak to our reporter, Jenny Davidson. Now, Jenny, there was a dramatic moment this week as the Health Secretary resigned shortly before First Minister's questions.
That's right, Helen. The Health Secretary, Michael Matheson, announced his resignation on Thursday morning, just before First Minister's questions. This comes as he was expecting the results of an investigation by the Scottish Parliament corporate body into an £11,000 data roaming bill that was run up on a Scottish Parliament iPad during a family holiday to Morocco just over a year ago. Later emerged that this was due to his sons using the iPad as a hotspot for streaming football. Now, in his resignation letter, Michael Matheson said he was resigning now to avoid becoming a distraction. He perhaps didn't quite manage that because immediately afterwards it came up at First Minister's questions, with Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross asking the First Minister if he now regretted giving Michael Matheson such fulsome backing and suggesting he probably should have asked him to stand down earlier.
Let's be clear. Michael Matheson was dishonest about his £11,000 iPad bill. He made a false claim for thousands of pounds of taxpayers' money. He misled the public, the press and this Parliament. He kept on being dishonest even as his story changed. He's resigned, but Humza Yousaf should have sacked him the minute it became clear that Michael Matheson had not told the truth. And again, in this lengthy letter from the former Health Secretary, there is not one word of apology to the people of Scotland for what he did and his dishonesty. And I hope the First Minister will stand up and apologise on his behalf.
Douglas Ross may not want to listen to what I've got to say, but of course he can read over the official record in this chamber when Michael Matheson made a personal statement. He reiterated his apology on numerous occasions for the mistake he had made. And he did make a mistake. I'm not suggesting he did not. All I'm suggesting is that, of course, a man who has served this Parliament for many years, decades in fact, has worked diligently, worked hard in every role that he has been in, was afforded due process. He has been afforded that due process and come to the conclusion that he should stand down.
Now, it's a big blow for First Minister Humza Yousaf, obviously Health Secretary, a significant role in government, and Michael Matheson, an experienced government minister and a key ally of Humza Yousaf personally. And it's meant there's had to be a reshuffle in government because not only Michael Matheson standing down, but earlier in the week, the Drugs and Alcohol Minister, Elena Whittam, stood down for personal reasons, so two vacant roles in government needing to be filled.
And MSPs have also been looking at plans to raise the minimum unit price for alcohol. What's the background to that?
Well, back in 2018, Scotland became the first country in the world to set a minimum price for each unit of alcohol. The idea was to reduce alcohol intake and therefore alcohol-related health problems. Back then it was set at 50p per unit, but obviously inflation has perhaps eroded the effect of that somewhat, so it's recommended that it be raised to 65p a unit. Alongside that, there was a sunset clause in the original legislation, meaning it would run out in April if it wasn't renewed. Now, Michael Matheson was actually due to give a statement to Parliament on Thursday afternoon on minimum unit pricing, and Deputy First Minister Shona Robson had to step in at the last minute. But earlier in the week, Holyrood's Health Committee was hearing from alcohol charities about the positive effects of minimum unit pricing. They were told that an estimated 156 lives a year had been saved through the policy. But Conservative MSP Sandish Gulhani questioned whether really there was the data to back up some of the claims.
You know, families don't really understand why this is still being debated. You know, they want to see action. They want to see action on other issues as well, marketing, availability and treatment. And, you know, we are part of the public health community, not just in Scotland, we're part of the international public health community. And that community is united in believing the evidence and understanding the evidence that, you know, MUP saves lives. So, you know, It is designed as a whole population approach. We can see it has reduced consumption, it has reduced hospital admissions, and it has reduced deaths.
Sorry, can I ask you for the evidence that it's reduced hospital admissions, please?
The evidence has all been presented to you.
Was it statistically significant?
It's the papers we've shared show that hospital admissions have reduced by 13.4%.
Was it statistically significant?
I'm here as a charity CEO. I'm not going to start arguing with you over statistical significance. I think you should be focusing on the fact that MUP has saved lives. I think you're possibly the only person in the room, I'm not sure, who doesn't believe the evidence. But I think, I am standing firm with the public health community across the world, saying that price is the most effective mechanism for reducing harm and reducing deaths.
Sorry, so, I do believe the evidence. I want to make that abundantly clear, and this is why I'm asking the questions.
Now, while public health bodies are generally in favour of minimum unit pricing, the drinks industry and retailers have been less so. And they've been raising concerns this week. 16 business bodies have written to the Deputy First Minister, raising concerns about the floating of an idea of another public health levy, a sort of surtax on retailers selling alcohol and tobacco that's been floated by the Scottish Government. But I spoke to the First Minister earlier in the week. He said that at the moment it's just an idea that's being discussed and no decision has been made about that.
Now, we've talked on this programme before about plans to reform the justice system in Scotland and even to introduce juryless trials. Now, this week, MSPs were hearing from solicitors who were opposed to the plans. What did they say?
Well, that's right. This is Holyrood's Criminal Justice Committee has been looking at the proposed changes in the Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Bill. And as you say, probably the most controversial proposal in that bill is the idea of having judge-only, juryless trials in rape cases, running a pilot of that to see how it works now. There have been concerns actually raised by the legal profession, but also actually from some rape survivors as well, in evidence given to the committee. But the strongest opposition has come from the Scottish Solicitors Bar Association, who've said their members will not take part. They would boycott any such pilot, and they were giving evidence to the committee this week.
So, if the association does believe in the rule of law, on what basis do your members have the right not to follow the rule of law?
We are not following the rule of law. We are choosing not to take on particular types of work. If we are faced with a forum in which we do not think an accused person is getting a fair trial, then we can decide that we don't want to be part of that. We are all self-employed individuals. We all run our own trial. We all run our own businesses, and we all have the right to pick and choose what work we do.
But I'm just interested in what the stance that the association is taking will say to the wider audience in Scotland about what it says about the legal profession if the legal profession is not prepared to engage in what has been defined as the law of Scotland.
Okay, well, I would say first of all the stance that we would be taking in such circumstances would be that we do not believe our clients would receive a fair trial in these circumstances, and we're not prepared to take part in it.
Now, the Criminal Justice Committee has finished hearing evidence at stage 1 on this bill, and given the scale of the changes proposed and also the range of evidence they've heard, I think it's going to be quite a challenge for them to reach a conclusion on what should and what shouldn't be in this bill.
Thanks, Jenny. Well, let's return to Westminster now, to Sean, to find out what else has been going on. And at the start of the week, the Defence Secretary came to the Commons to inform MPs about another round of joint US and UK airstrikes against the Houthis in Yemen. What did he have to say?
Yes, so the Houthis have been attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea for some time. And there have been a number of these strikes, and some of them have been the United States acting on their own, but others have been joint strikes, which has seen the RAF being involved. There was one at the end of last week, and so this was the first chance that the government had had to update MPs. And the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, came along. He made the statement, and he was very critical, as you'd expect, of the Houthis, who are an Iranian-backed group. He described them as opportunist pirates, and it was interesting because there was a degree of cross-party agreement, as we'll hear.
We're not seeking confrontation, and we urge the Houthis and all those who enable them to stop these illegal and unacceptable attacks. But if necessary, the UK will not hesitate to respond again in self-defence.
It is the Prime Minister that should be making this statement to the House, just as he did after the 2 previous UK strikes on Houthi targets. It is the Prime Minister's responsibility to authorise such UK military action in the name of the Cabinet, advised of course by others, including and especially by the Defence Secretary. So I just say this: the government risks downgrading respect for the Convention, that having given the go-ahead for such action, it is the Prime Minister that then reports directly to this House.
It is actually the Secretary of State for Defence who has legal responsibility, who signs off the targets and indeed signs the legal authority for these. So technically it is indeed me who should be standing here, other than, of course, in the first couple of rounds where the Prime Minister was dealing with something which was new and therefore very appropriate. But the wider point that I just gently make to him is the Prime Minister is in Northern Ireland today, doing incredibly important work, which, well, I hear from a sedentary position the idea that we should have been recalled yesterday, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure that would have been entirely practical.
The people of Scotland and elsewhere on these islands deserve to know what the plan is with regard to this crisis in the Red Sea, not the timings or the detail of missions or the tactical ambition or resources behind these, but the broad strategy which is being pursued with lethal force in our name and in the absence of parliamentary approval. We have already made clear from the SNP benches that we support the government and international partners in direct action to uphold freedom of navigation and the law of the sea, but this should never have been taken for granted and remains subject to realistic interpretation of both self-defence and imminence.
Is it the government's plan to commit to sustained military action? And if so, surely it's only right for Parliament to have its say in the appropriate way.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this is the third time that we've come and made a statement, and I know the Honourable Lady has made other contributions to the debate. So we do feel that Parliament is being fully engaged in this process. We're not looking to make this as a sustained long-term military action. Indeed, I can guarantee the House that if the Houthis stop, we will have absolutely no requirement again to drop munitions on the Houthis.
Thank you for now, Sean. Well, let's go to the Welsh Parliament and talk to our reporter, Larry Glyn-Jones. Now, there was a significant intervention from the Welsh Government this week. Ministers have decided to take over a fire service because of a culture of sexual harassment and misogyny. What's the background to this?
Yes, this report came out in January of this year. It was a damning report and found issues with sexual harassment and misogyny at the South Wales Fire and Rescue Service. Following the report, the Chief Fire Officer, Hugh Jakeway, said he would retire. But it seems Hannah Blythen, the Deputy Minister for Social Partnership, has said that she wasn't sufficiently reassured that the changes that needed to be made would be made. And this has led us to this point where the Deputy Minister has made this quite unprecedented intervention in terms of the Welsh Government after she said she had no faith in the organisation's ability to run itself and that they would then appoint 4 commissioners to take over the fire brigade.
I'm pleased the FRA's response formally accepts the report's recommendations in full. It could hardly do otherwise given the weight of evidence in the report, but I have seen little that adequately addresses the wider concerns that I set out previously. Sadly, I do not have confidence that the service has the internal capacity or capability to oversee its own recovery. Management at all levels, up to and including the highest, has been implicated in the identified failings. They cannot be both the problem and the solution. And the Chief Fire Officer's stated intention to retire is clearly insufficient to stimulate the wholesale change in processes, values and culture which will be necessary. The authority's plan calls for support from the Welsh Government, the WLJ and others. That is reasonable, but such support needs strong foundations and clear and committed leadership to drive through change, and I see no evidence of that.
Hannah Blythen went on to say that the failings at the South Wales Fire and Rescue Service could put lives at risk, and the service seemed to be uninterested in finding better ways of fighting house fires. Now, this intervention is significant because it clearly makes the link between poor culture, poor management and poor outcomes for the public an issue of great seriousness, considering that the main job of the fire service is to protect people from coming into harm.
Indeed. Now, before Christmas, we got a draft budget from the Welsh Government, and since then, parliamentary committees have had a chance to really scrutinise those plans, haven't they?
Yes, so the Welsh Government say it's the starkest and most difficult budget since devolution. It saw them outline how they were planning to make £600 million of cuts to the budget for the next financial year. They want to protect the NHS and Transport for Wales, namely the hugely expensive rail project that they're undertaking at the moment, and protect money for local government. They say they're protecting frontline services and the most vulnerable. But in a debate this week on the draft budget, the chairs of different scrutiny committees who have, as you said, have been looking over this draft budget in recent weeks, they and opposition parties raised concerns about the Welsh Government's plans.
We found weaknesses in several key areas of the draft budget which casts doubt on whether it is fulfilling the Minister's main objectives. Firstly, there are question marks over whether funding levels within the draft budget are sufficient to protect frontline services, which is one of the Welsh Government's guiding principles. The committee is particularly concerned with the funding shortfalls facing frontline services funded by local authorities, particularly education, housing and social care. We're highly concerned by evidence which suggests that the Welsh Government's budgetary decisions are likely to have a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable in society at a time when it is needed the most.
Just look at the local government settlement at 3%, a huge real terms cut which will mean councils will struggle to deliver essential services. As the WLJ told the Finance Committee, the 3% only amounts to around a third of the pressure facing local services. So it will inevitably mean difficult choices, job losses and service cuts.
One interesting point we heard from Rebecca Evans, the Finance Minister in the Welsh Government, in the debate this week as well, particularly in light of what we heard about the extra money given to Northern Ireland earlier in the programme, is that the Welsh Government are now making the case that the issues in Northern Ireland with public services are issues here too, and they're calling on the UK Government to give them an equal opportunity to address those pressures.
We've talked before on this programme about plans for big job losses at Tata Steel in Port Talbot. That came up again this week, didn't it?
Yes, indeed. The 2,800 job losses at Tata Steel are still big news here in Wales, still a huge cause for concern. There'd been hope by workers, by the Labour Party, by unions, that the company would reconsider its plans to close both blast services at Port Talbot by the end of this year if the Labour Party were to win the next election and to come in with a lot of extra money on the table. But the chief executive of Tata Steel UK was in front of the Economy Committee here in the Senedd this week. And it seems, he says anyway, there's no way of keeping that second blast furnace open in order to avoid a jobs cliff edge.
The single most important criticality is, if we consider all this, we have come to understand now, after a detailed analysis of the proposals which the union has given us, that we will not be in a position to build the EAF in an existing operating steel shop. So that becomes the imperative, Mr. David. And by default, if you don't have a steel shop that is operating, there is no way the blast furnaces can be kept going.
So it seems it's a technicality that's stopping them building that electric arc furnace as opposed to just money. But he did go on to say that he'd had conversations with Sir Keir Starmer, including the day before that Tata made the announcement about restructuring the plant, which suggests that the money on the table is perhaps just not enough.
Thanks to Larry. Now, we've got time to just bring you one more story from Westminster. Sean, the budget. It's about a month away, always a big deal. This could be the last one before a general election. But we heard the Shadow Chancellor and the Chancellor debating the economy this week. What did you make of it?
Yes, well, not long to go now before the budget. And as you say, it's going to be a big political moment. This week, Jeremy Hunt faced MPs in the Commons for his last question time before that budget. Now, interestingly, he was quite keen to talk about some of Labour's plans. But it's a big moment for the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, as well, because it's a parliamentary tradition that it's the Leader of the Opposition who replies to the budget. So the Shadow Chancellor just has to sort of sit there. They can pass the occasional note to the Leader of the Opposition, but they don't get their moment in the spotlight until the next day when MPs continue the debate. So this was her last chance, really, to face Jeremy Hunt and challenge him before his big day. And she was focusing on the challenges facing people trying to buy their own home.
Last week at Prime Minister's questions, when asked about the Tory mortgage penalty, the Prime Minister boasted that someone coming off a fixed-rate mortgage deal would be able to save hundreds of pounds, but the small print was that they had to add many years to their mortgage. 3 million people are coming off fixed-rate mortgage deals this year and last. Does the Chancellor agree with the Prime Minister that British homeowners have never had it so good?
Chancellor? Well, what I would say to her is that the way that we're helping people with mortgages, families with mortgages, is not just through the mortgage charter, which is a lifeline to many families, but by bringing down inflation. And we've been, having a few pops about Labour's confusion over its £28 billion policy. But the real reason that we're against it is because going on a borrowing splurge pushes up inflation, pushes up interest rates, and makes mortgages more expensive.
Could the Chancellor explain to the House, if he had an ambition to spend an additional £28 billion a year on something, what level of tax would that impose on ordinary households?
Well, I thank her for asking that question. I'm curious as to where that figure 28 billion has come from. But as she has asked it, I will tell her that to increase spending by 28 billion, if you're going to stick to fiscal rules, as the party opposite claims they will do, would mean increasing income tax by 4% or increasing the corporation tax that they say they're going to cap by 8%.
Wow. Regardless of what the Chancellor tells us, the reality remains that after 14 years of this Tory government, people in Bradford are far worse off. Healthcare, GPs and dentists are less accessible, homes are more expensive, colder and riddled with mould, jobs are less secure and badly paid with stagnating wages, whilst household savings have been left wiped out with rising food, water, energy and fuel bills. So isn't it time, ahead of the last budget he'll deliver before the general election, will the Chancellor apologise for 14 years of disaster that's devastated our communities?
Let me tell him some positive messages he can take home to his constituents in Bradford. Violent crime halved, burglaries halved, school standards up, NHS, more doctors and nurses than ever in history, and for people on the minimum wage or national living wage, their real after-tax income up by 30% if they work full-time.
Now, the House of Commons is in recess next week, but there are some things we should still watch out for, aren't there?
Yes, so MPs are having a half-term break, but members of the House of Lords will be here at Westminster. They're sitting for 3 days next week, and they're going to be starting their line-by-line scrutiny of the Rwanda bill. Now, we already have had an indication that probably this bill is going to make it through the Lords and go back to the Commons, but there's a very real chance that as they go through this, the Lords will propose amendments so it could go back change. So that's quite a big moment in the debate about the Rwanda plan, but it's also a big week politically, so bits of Parliament may not be here, but politics doesn't stop because, of course, Rishi Sunak faces the challenge of 2 by-elections near the end of the week.
Thanks, Sean. Sounds like it could be an interesting one. Well, that's all we've got time for. We're taking a break for recess next week, but Politics Live will be back here on BBC Two on Friday, the 16th of February, to analyse the results of those 2 by-elections. Do join us then.